want to start? What are 2 or 3 big points that it makes implicitly or explicitly?
Well, I think one of the explicit points is that a politician will move their political views based off of the wants of the citizens or the effectiveness of the lobbying groups involved.
Anybody want to agree or qualify that? Okay, okay, well, I guess I'd qualify it in saying that's the context is stressed a little bit there. That is, one class of theories, the strong leadership theories, do not talk about the leadership as changing. So point one you're making is it's multi-causal. That is, we're not saying, here is the course. A causes B. That's all you need to know. The substructure causes the superstructure, or from a simple version of Marx, or Hegel. The Geist, the spirit of the age, the zeitgeist explains what happens from 1850 to 1870. That's called a sort of a culturalistic interpretation. We're not saying either of those. We're not saying any one factor drives. In the course, in the readings, you find diversity. You do find some one-factor determinists that we will read. And they will say, hey, my variable, my framework explains all you need to know. There's no head in some of these readings. Okay. So multi-causality is one thing which it underlines by showing not one variable, but multiple variables all playing an important role. Second point, they're interrelated. So it may be that the importance of one variable will shift depending on the context as well as the other variables that are there. Someone talked to me about a possible BA paper on the South Side and racism. Wanted to talk today. Okay. Want to mention your idea just briefly and how that might fit or not fit in this framework?
Sure. So my idea was to write about public transportation in Chicago and how public transportation was designed to potentially limit the free flow of movement of different populations of people, because Chicago is one of the most segregated cities in the country. For example, the Purple Line of the L stops in Skokie, and there's been discussion about that as a decision to limit Black populations from moving into the suburbs. And then I think we talked about the first class, the highway as a wall in between neighborhoods. So I wanted to write about that.
Well, I actually had a similar idea. At the moment, they changed the red line schedule so that half the trains running south. I live in Englewood. Half the trains that would normally serve my area now divert to serve Hyde Park through where the green line would go in the evening. So essentially, it means the very wealthy areas don't get their fares cut while they work on the red line, but we do. And we also have the freeway cutting us off, which is very similar to how it's set up back home in Belfast. But we actually have physical rules as well between different religious neighbourhoods. So it's a different kind of less obvious segregation stuff coming into town and getting in their way. So I can do a comparison of the two.
I don't want to shut all this up. I'm just trying to shut. Oh, I see. Are you using that?
Mm-mm.
No. Okay. maybe I'll ask you if nobody else knows. The guy who was in there yesterday, the IT expert, said on these buttons that we can just turn off the video, which is now right here in my eyes. I'm trying to shut that off. No, I think that's the light. This is the video here. Okay.
Okay.
Um,
So you're looking for the light to be turned off?
The one light, the spotlight right on the podium, I'm trying to turn on.
All right, sounds good.
But leave the rest of the lights on. Okay. Sorry. Okay. Both of you have not proposed a multi-causal interpretation, have you? What's the driver in your story? And I mean, how would you show an X causes Y summary of what you both said? And you can try, or others can try to help them.
In Belfast, it's caused by essentially fear of what the two groups do to each other. So the side of the stronger political power, which is the Protestant side, had more sway with the politicians and the decision makers, and therefore they generally have the better served neighbourhoods. So it was how lobbying can be disproportionately swayed by one group over another.
But you're basically telling a story of conflict between two groups. And what are the two groups that has an analog to the neighborhood in Chicago?
Well, I live in the south. Well, like I said, I live in Englewood, and we have
No, but in Belfast, it's
Yeah.
Protestant versus Catholic.
yeah,
In Englewood, the story you're telling is black versus white. It's race. It's race or ethnicity or religion, basically.
It's referred to as a bad neighborhood. It's actually not a bad neighborhood, but yeah.
Okay. No, but if you're saying they did not build the rapid transit to go past Skokie, you're not telling a multi-causal story, 15 things. The general story which involves that, still on. Okay, there we go.
That do it?
Perfect, yeah. So that, which button is that?
That's the fourth from the bottom here.
The fourth from far to the right. So is that the last or the second to last?
That means the last.
Second to last, yeah. That's what the expert is just walking and showed you. Second to last button. Okay. Okay.
You got it?
Yeah, we just got it. Thank you much. Okay. We don't want to go too far with this now, but I'll simply make the point that as we will see in the readings, different writers may say X causes Y, such as black-white conflict causes racial segregation, causes the location of a green line, causes the construction of the freeway. And there are many books written by experts and stories written on Chicago, which will say, and no doubt it was part of some of the discussions, that the Dan Ryan Expressway, 9095, which runs from Wisconsin to New York, goes right down between Bridgeport and Bronzeville. And it was located there to keep the blacks out of Bridgeport. It was a black-white segregation. Okay, would you expect, general question for everyone, that interpretation explains everything about the location of the freeway? No. So it may be one factor, but maybe there are other factors as well, and how they fit together is what we want to get out, in part, take out of the course by reading one book which may say it's all race. Another one may say it's transit making a line as short as possible. A third may say it has to do with the weather. A fourth may say it has to do with the gerrymandering of the boundaries. A fifth may say it depends on the size of the city council and the coalition which changed over the years from historical periods in the city council. All of these may be partially right, is what I'm saying. And what I'm cautioning you and asking you to look for in the course is going beyond one factor interpretations of most, now here I'll generalize a little, most anything in the social sciences involving people, including the arts, including many of the humanities. and I propose a way to look at this. Look at anything you want to see studied in the social sciences, or so what people do. Look for studies that compare, that do this, where they report what I mentioned as an adjusted R-square statistic, and that tells you how much is explained by all of the variables in the model. And what you find in most of the social sciences studies in economics, political science, sociology, geography, etc., is most social science models, with all their variables, 5, 10, 15, 20 variables, explain about 15%. Not much more. Which is to say, there's a lot of noise. There's lots of randomness, there's error, there's chance, there's idiosyncratic combinations of who was in the room at that meeting that day, which is more important than race, or class, or gender, or income, or national origin, are the standard things that you get in most social science readings and courses, and especially in the media, which simplifies still further. So I'm not saying ignore the media, I'm saying use them and try to locate them in a more subtle context where you can say, why do the media simplify? Where and why do certain books simplify? And how can we fit them together in a framework where they can help us? We don't say one is right and one is wrong. How can we use them together is what this, so question, comment.
So something similar. So I've been watching a Ken Burns documentary on the history of New York City, and in particular with Robert Moses.
Good.
So let's say my argument was he built Jones Beach and the Southern State Parkway with the intention of it being racist. But as part of that multi-causality, I also mentioned how he was also a fan of the car and did not believe in public transportation.
That's two factors. That's pretty good. There's a book about 1,000 pages by Robert Caro that
Yes.
Richard Taub used for years in teaching public policy, which everybody used to read. These days, not everybody's read it, but I mean, it has those, and it has 990 pages more. But those are key bottom lines in the book. So are you putting that forth as an example of, or what's your more general point? Okay.
I'm just trying to find examples.
Okay. No, and these are, you could say this is an example of two of that. What you said, this is an example of two factors each operating. One can be racism, one can be support for the car. And we could go beyond that, but I'm simply trying to say, let's have one of our exercises in the course being able to take newspaper, media, arguments among students and others, and then translate them into coherent, testable propositions, and then see if we can, what evidence there is. Yes?
Regarding the race as a causality, do you find that in American urban sociology or policy in particular, like what you were talking about first class about the strength of the political cultures of the South and New England, have more power in these theories because it's such a young country and because we are still very much embedded in those political cultures than say studying urban sociology in Japan or in France or something. So there is a racial element, but it's not as it doesn't have the same kind of explanatory power as in the United States, or is that not a discrepancy? Or
Who's here from Europe? Anybody? You want to comment on how salient or how salient and how tolerant are the French vis-a-vis Muslims in France versus the Americans versus Muslims in the U.S.? And based on its citizens and/or specific political leaders' statements.
Okay, I don't think I'm qualified enough to comment on the relationship between the Asian Americans and African Muslims. But as far as French people are concerned, well, there has been, I would say, more
Sorry, more what?
more Islamophobic tension in France since the terrorist attacks of 2015. And far-right parties have tried to exploit this, especially Front National, with, very racist and in a way Nazi ideas, but I don't think they have succeeded in exploiting totally the fears of that French people can have. They lost the election in May, and right now the far right is it's kind of breaking down. There are two parties which are going to separate each other. One thing that I know also is that we wouldn't see in France a ban on Muslim countries such as the one that has been imposed by President Trump recently.
Yes.
I think that I understand in terms of like there's a lot of analogous phenomena regarding immigration and just racist responses to and far right responses to globalization, especially in more recent years, and with the increase of movement of population. But what I think my question is specifically regarding the structure of urban settings in cities, just also in their relationship to rural areas in those, because the history is so much older in other places than it is here. So it's because, for example, that you brought up Muslim populations and Islamophobic discrimination. It's like that's a phenomenon in some senses that's newer to the United States than anti-blackness and due to American slavery that persisted for such a long time. And since that particular phenomenon did not happen to the same degree or at the same time in other places, do you think that creates a separation?
Okay, my quick answer is history and amount of time is almost empty as a powerful explanation. I'd say what happened over time is what's critical. And then what the residue is today is what we study and call political culture in that sense.
I'm going to say that I'm also from Europe, you can guess by the accent, but I actually wrote my thesis on this exact subject last year, and Islamophobia has been an issue in France for a long time with the ban of the hijab in schools and things like that. And there's an argument that the reason why it's been a target for attacks in the past has been because the Islamic population perceive themselves to be more outcasts and are therefore more likely to form enclaves, so they're more vulnerable to radicalization. But the big thing right now is Britain's vote to leave the EU, and that's because they want to reinstitute border controls to stop refugees being able to come in, and it's actually caused a really big thing because
Brexit.
Yeah.
Okay. This is the UK is leaving in good part for this reason. Okay, it's the simple point.
Yeah, basically, I know quite a lot about Brexit because what's happened is the North of Ireland voted to stay in, and since they voted to stay, because of that, everyone who wanted to be part of Britain is now applying for the Irish citizenship they're entitled to. Things like the racism in France and in Europe in general has been a problem for a really long time.
Let me introduce here briefly a threefold quick interpretation I sometimes use. Three conceptions of citizenship. The first is basically ideas. Or sorry, let me start at the other end. Citizenship is based on blood. If you were born the son or the daughter of a person of this background, Jewish, Muslim, you are Jewish or Muslim. And whatever you say or do will never change that. That's one conception of citizenship. Another conception of citizenship is where your blood background counts for nothing. Or that is, What's critical is what is in your head and what you say and do. And this is closer to the New England moralist Calvinist perspective, and you can see elements of this in the idea that you can look at immigration patterns and rules and regulations and so forth. And some have said if you memorize the Gettysburg Address and a few more things like that, you can be an American. Whereas in France, in earlier years, you could never be a French person in your first generation. Your children could become French, but immigrants could never become French citizens. Okay, so in a sense, those are two polar extremes. And we can plot, and I would suggest, if you look at the language of people in Asia and in Africa, you have the more clear use of the bloodline meaning of citizenship. The Chinese talk of the Japanese and vice versa as separate races, even though the Japanese, they're the same basic, I mean, they all came from the same place. The Koreans, the Japanese, the Chinese all came from the same background. But they talk of each other now as separate races. So their thinking is bloodlines. Okay. You have elements of that with African Americans and in the American South, but the New England pattern is to say, no, that's wrong, that's immoral, and that's wrong to try to do. And Hyde Park, in that sense, is closer to the New England moralist tradition. Okay, so the issue is not what's right, but what is in people's heads, and I'm saying that contingent on the conception of citizenship, you can get very different answers to what is the context in this sense. Some Japanese families, for instance, one quick example, would hire a private detective to make sure that the prospective spouse had no Korean blood. Because Koreans were the main minority migrating to Japan, because until the last decade or so, there were almost no other immigrants to Japan, period. There are no Muslims in Japan. They don't let them in at all. Okay, so, all right, in a sense, that's part of the context, which is what this stresses. So, having little bits of tourism, little bits of some anecdotal, descriptive points like this can help to say, how big are the differences? But I don't want to go on too long on this right now. But quick question or follow-up?
Oh, you just said three conceptions of citizenship, so I was wondering what the third one was. You said three conceptions of citizenship?
Yeah, I'd say the third is mixed, really, a mixture of the two, and you tend to get that more traditionally, I would say, in Europe. So, I mean, the Nazis stressed bloodlines, Blut and Boden. The Dutch, the Swiss, stress something closer to New England. So you have variations within Europe and over time, but the French National Front, with the founder of the party, Mr. Le Pen, would say in open speeches, Africans are racially inferior. They can't do well in our schools. Don't let them in. They'll lower the standards of the schools because they're genetically lower than we are. Okay, if you look at speeches by even the most traditional anti-black political leaders, George Wallace was the major example who ran against Nixon in the mid-20th century. He never said anything that outspoken and specific. He would talk about them, he would talk about bad things might happen, and then when African Americans became a large enough bloc, he completely reversed his position and he supported racial integration. So the daughter of Le Pen has changed, but she's not going that far. Okay. All right, so that is, yes, these are important, as I mentioned, racial treating of race in the political context is still the #1 cleavage in the United States. But I would say it is less salient, and how it's specifically conceived is less primordial than in Japan or Korea or many other places in the world. Okay. Even though they may have longer histories. Okay. Let's push on with Next big idea is markets. That is, the first section is leadership. Second is markets. Big readings are Peterson and Saassen. Paul Peterson was here for a number of years, and we had many good discussions. We taught a seminar together where I was writing City Money, and he was writing his book, City Limits. And each week, we had one chapter from each book. And each week, we found that we were on completely opposing sides of sorts. We didn't realize it in advance. But it was remarkable, and so we've been playing with ways of integrating them since. He made a quasi-deterministic version of this argument. His student, who was in the seminar, Ken Wong, made a more subtle and nuanced version of the same argument in his book, City Choices. And then Ken Wong was on our faculty for 10 years, and I taught courses with him on urban policy where it would fit much more easily. Saassen's argument is the same basic argument, but it's global rather than cross-city and national. Peterson suggests there are three kinds of policies. What are they? Yes?
They are just developmental, redistributed, and allocation.
Excellent. Okay. Tell us a sentence or two on each of these. Somebody. Anybody else, or you can if nobody else volunteers. Go ahead.
Okay, so developmental policies enhance the economic position of the city, redistributed, like benefit lower income residents, but like can also potentially negatively affect the local economy, and allocational.
Yeah, redistribute takes money from the rich, gives it to the poor,
Right.
basically, and through policies of government.
Like has mutual economic effects, but it's like basically like, you know, like fire department and schools and things like that.
Okay, so this is the third. Allocational is something as where does a policeman go? Where do the police cars drive? And that you can allocate to one neighborhood or one block more easily than you can a welfare program which is based on income, not on the city block you live on. So the allocational services, police, fire, sewage, sanitation, things that go to particular geographic areas, and they can be allocated based on parties, ethnicity, geography, whatever. But Peterson then goes a step further and he says, local governments cannot do redistributive policies. Why not? Yes?
Didn't he speak something about like the net benefit always being negative or something like that?
But why? I mean, what's in simple terms? Okay, the former mayor of Boston was, basically, but Boston is Massachusetts and especially Boston, I mentioned, is classically New Deal Democrat, high spending, FDR, New Deal cities, with many of the citizens and especially the political leaders, like Kevin White, who I mentioned. There was an MIT professor who wrote a famous, Jay Forrester, who wrote a famous book called Urban Dynamics. And when one mayor of Boston finished his term, he came to MIT and they had offices adjacent to one another. And so Forrester said, let me try to spell out in computer simulation terms what happens if we do policy 1 versus policy 2 versus policy 3. If we think about it over 20, 30, 50, 70 years, what might change in terms of the economy, the population makeup, and who is there? And the simplest kind of thing he talked about was the idea that if we increase taxes and increase spending, and especially add redistribution from the rich to the poor, what will happen over 10, 20, 30, 40 years? What would you guess? Yes? The rich will leave. Yes. Okay, so the Peterson's argument is basically that. Mayors know this, or they think they know this. And they say, therefore, I as mayor of one city cannot do this alone, because if I raise my taxes way up and if I provide more services, especially for the poor, all the taxpayers will leave, or many of them over time. If I wait a century, they'll all leave. If I wait 5 years, if I wait 1 year, nothing may change. But over time, there could be big changes. All right, so what's Peterson conclude? Because Peterson was is a left Democrat. He's in favor of more equality. So basically his answer is the national government is the place that has to do redistribution. Because the local governments will lose out if they try to do so. And many economists, James Buchanan and others, have made the same argument. Peterson summarized sort of public choice emerging economic theories in the book, basically, in clear, simple terms. Okay, so if that's redistribution, basically says we have two choices, allocation and developmental. But in terms of the policy implications for leadership, his basic argument then is who leads more in different cities is basically, let me back up one step. The whole idea that we're following up is to look at the idea of separate issue areas or policy arenas, redistribution, allocation, and so forth. What that does is to say all the services a city provides are not equal. They vary in their dynamics. And if you look at them and see where and why they work, you can understand some of the differences. He suggests a lot of the differences. Okay, his basic corollary of that is in the developmental area, who tends to lead? Those people who have the most resources, the most interest, the most engagement in development. And those tend to be developers, business leaders, homeowners, real estate companies, and the like. By contrast, people interested in social welfare or kindergartens for the poor don't get involved in that issue area. Okay. And this is a big idea that we'll see through the course. It's in Dahl and other places. But it was a small revolution to introduce that idea. Most theories did not. Okay, so point one, business may be more important, but it's not general influence. It's in a particular issue area, economic development. By contrast, in allocational decisions, who tends to be more important? Those neighborhoods or those subgroups that want the specific service. So if you want more police protection, you say, we want more police in our neighborhood and we're not getting as many as they do over there. Allocate more to us. And so basically, some of the studies of this, there's a PhD on this by a guy who became the HUD chief economist, which basically showed in Chicago, the rich and the poorest neighborhoods got the most police patrols. The middle-income neighborhoods got fewer in Chicago. Okay. Saassen, okay, well, I'll just add one more quick point, which was Peterson sent the manuscript to Aaron Vildovsky, who sent it back with one sentence. What about New York? Why did Vildovsky ask that question, and how does New York fit with this? New York has engaged in more redistribution than most U.S. cities. Now, it's doing much less than the federal government, but through parts of the 20th century, it had many immigrants who were in favor of more redistribution. Activists, in especially ethnic groups, with the Irish and Italian Catholics in the Democratic Party, the Jews in the unions, hospital groups that were pressing for support for from the city government for their ethnic and other hospitals. Those were more actively supported in in New York than most other cities. Esther Fuchs, F-U-C-H-S, did a PhD on New York and Chicago and compared these more specifically. But the big point was, in the 1930s and after the New York fiscal crisis in 1974-75, these redistributive programs were cut way back. And you had, in part because the city was on the verge of bankruptcy, they said, we have to have more money from the state capital. The state capital said, we can't do this. They took it to Washington. And so the Department of Treasury, et cetera, got involved. And they created a board of fiscal overseers and the like after these two crises. And they said, you must cut back or we're not going to give you any money, and you won't have any money to continue paying your staff at all. So the city became fiscally conservative under outside pressure, especially in those two time periods. But so my point is, there has been pressure in pushing toward redistribution in New York, but the dynamics illustrate in part the more general proposition that when it's in competition with other cities, next important general point of Peterson, which links him to others in the course, such as Saassen, Glaser, and others. What's the driver of this process that I'm going through? These processes I'm going through, either development or redistribution, or the lack of redistribution, or the types of allocation. The key driver is competition. It's competition between neighborhoods within a city, but especially from one city to another city, which leads the city to feel it has to do this, or it will lose out in its potential of people moving to it or investing in the city. Okay, so in that sense, the processes are more economic. They're the variables, the concepts that are more commonly used in economics: markets, competition, prices. You know, people moving up or down as based on that, or then anticipating that. And that illustrates the direction that a lot of political science went to in the 70s, 80s, and 90s in the U.S. Others at the same time, as I've said, were reacting against it. But Peterson thus was hated, argued with, etc., by people like Clarence Stone. So we talked about that last time. Okay, Saassen extends this marketization argument of Peterson globally, but she is not a strict Adam Smith market analyst. She makes several points in this introduction of her influential book. One, global markets are dispersed and competitive, but the key corporations retain command centers at their peaks, which are located at headquarters, often in a handful of so-called global cities. These few cities are distinctive due to their high density of producer services. Key concepts: global cities, producer services, command and control centers. Producer services are things like accounting and law firms, management consulting, advertising and finance, which she suggests depend more on personal face-to-face contacts with top executives of top global corporations, hence London, New York, and Tokyo. As manufacturing declines, older industrial cities lose their power, wealth, and residence to these fewer global world cities. Similarly, middle managers lose income and decline in number, as do highly skilled and highly paid production workers, as they're replaced by higher tech machines and the lowest cost workers globally who can do the jobs of production with computers, which computers, global communication, and air transit make possible. Then, in a controversial extension of this manufacturing decline argument, she suggested income inequality rises in the world cities with the impact of global markets, since the affluent grow more affluent still. And these affluent bankers and lawyers spend more for maid services, chauffeurs, and others who are at the bottom end of the income scale, thereby generating more inequality of income. Okay, so we can quickly summarize, give you a little picture of this. Here's my simple picture. Can you aim that around, or is this
Yeah.
enough here? All right. Just need a Okay. Actually, let's see if this other just went up. Okay, this is the basic Sasson theory. A second kind of theory, which we'll introduce in a minute, is that globalization may lead to inequality, but that in turn may lead to anti-inequality policies. That is, I think it's Thailand has said no NGOs may function in Thailand because they are disrupting our political system. Okay, that's a consequence of seeing these kinds of things coming into a country. So after you see bad things happening, you could say we're going to change it. Or in New York City, we had this inequality or that is in the, I won't say, it may not just be inequality. I'm saying you can have A leads to B leads to C. Or, Model 3, you can have globalization may lead to inequality or these anti-inequality policies as A or B. Or you can have theory 4 down here. Other variables may matter a whole lot too. And that these can be C and D. Examples. Things which are not mentioned in the Sasson book is politics, political parties. People can campaign and parties can say, elect me and I will make income more equal. Or elect me and I will make America great again. Okay, so in that sense, you have people campaigning based on other things which may or may not be related to globalization. And so globalization may explain 2%, 5%, 15%. We don't know. You know, it depends on how you do the study. But the point is, globalization is not explaining everything. It's one factor along, and it may be that these other things are so important, and the anticipation of these potential of inequalities, the anticipation that this path might happen, that is the anticipate. If this is A and this is B here, the anticipation that A might happen may lead B to jump in early and say, no, we're not going to do that. Okay, so what I'm suggesting here is simply that Sasson gives you mainly number 1. But that number 2, number 3, and number 4 are all logically reasonable alternatives. And I'm suggesting if you're thinking about a BA on rail transit, think about something like this, where you say, what else could we bring in which is a plausible alternative to just racism? Okay? Let's see. Let's jump a little further and just mention examples of people and smart people who've proposed alternatives. And Robert, that is this idea of globalization leading to inequality has generated a lot of debate, a lot of ideological debate especially, but also a little, that is the more serious analytical background comes from Marx and Lenin. Lenin wrote more than did Marx about the imperialism, capitalism and imperialism internationally. So this idea then in the more recent years, John Friedman is a planner at UCLA. He stressed this in his work on Latin America in particular, and Sasson took it from Friedman, but she doesn't cite Marx, she doesn't cite Lenin, she doesn't cite Friedman, basically. She writes it all as if it's sort of normal and natural, and that's the way it works. It's her style. We taught several courses together. But if we sort these sources out, you see in a sense some of the broader simplifications, the assumptions, the problems, and the resolutions for alternatives. Okay, so if that's part of the background, Bob Lucas, Nobel laureate here in economics, had a theory which was, okay, Sossen's is positive. Lucas said, no, it's negative. It's the opposite. How could he say the opposite? Who's majoring in economics? You have several people in here. It's an economy. Okay, economics majors. Anybody in public policy? Who's had an economics course? Not a single one of you have ever had a single economics course? Okay, well, you should, especially in public policy. All right, now how many are majoring in public policy? Okay, you're slowly raising your hands. Okay, all right. The core ideas of public policy come from economics in most of the U.S. today. That's not always true. That wasn't true at Vildovsky's University, where there was political culture. That was a huge exception.
My guess would be that people say that globalization actually decreases inequality, gives people opportunities that it wouldn't otherwise, especially in these global cities, where we import both brain power from other countries and manual labor from other countries, so that actually it's an equalizer more than, it's a free market idea.
Okay, so you're saying it may be neither plus nor minus, it may be zero because of that differentiation. But to start just with the first part, why might it be negative? Why might inequality decrease due to globalization?
That's what I was trying to say, actually, and maybe I'm not an economist, so it didn't come out totally right.
I mean, you're making the same arguments that everybody makes in this.
That would be my guess, is that they would say that it reduces inequality because it provides opportunities for people. Is that what we're going for?
Okay, but let's just elaborate that a little more. How does it provide an opportunity, let's say, for a Mexican working on a farm to come to New York? How does that reduce inequality?
Supposedly because they would be coming to America where wages are better.
Yes.
That's obviously, I don't think how it plays out in practice, but that's an argument you hear.
Okay.
Like, economic growth would be an intervening variable, and that just generally, as an economy grows, it can better support the lowest classes and the poverty level rises.
Okay, so, I mean, these are basically the arguments that Lucas is making. If you're questioning, does it work, Lucas and others would say, he doesn't maybe make it that clear, but others have, what is the #1 economic industry in Mexico and the Philippines today?
The #1 export? People.
Okay, the export is people. What's the #1? If you look at, if you say, here's banking, here's agriculture, here's oil, and so forth. What's the biggest industry in terms of what contributes most to the GNP of Mexico and the Philippines?
Textiles.
No?
Maybe remittances.
There we go. Remittances. What are remittances?
Well, what people send back, what immigrants send back. Well,
Okay, so the Mexican farmer goes to New York, he drives a taxi, and he sends back half his paycheck to his mother and grandmother. Those remittances are the largest driver of the economy of Mexico today and the Philippines today, more than anything within the country. And it's even more true of, say, some of the Caribbean islands, where everybody leaves